I am Christopher Lewis, and these are Ruminations from Among the Bards. In my earlier ruminations, I introduced the idea of icons as roadmaps in the paths of story. And I made it clear, I hope, that I am talking about Orthodox Christian icons. What the icon shows is, in fact, a roadmap towards the ultimate goal of writing, of literature and literary tradition. Because icons are signs of an authentic exploration of the human condition. Ruminations from Among the Bards is to be a series of informal talks on literary tradition. I want to introduce some of the classics and their value. But in this subset, I want to concentrate on what I feel is missing in the general view of the Western literary tradition. And that is a very high level of learning, cultural awareness, and achievement, and even artistic talent among Eastern Orthodox writers that are little known in the West. These include figures from the first millennium of Western history, which is a period that is not very widely studied anymore. To understand icons as an authentic exploration of the human condition, we have to accept what many secular scholars acknowledge about cultural traditions, which is that the arts originated as a sacred act and a sacred expression, and this was later secularized. Poetry and music, for example, originated in hymns to the gods. Painting was originally considered a magical and mythical act. And these methods and artistic forms gradually became used in a more everyday manner, but still they retain remnants of sacred inspiration and awe. I want to return to this topic later when we speak of the classical invocation to the muse. Western artistic tradition reached its highest expression in the Christian Orthodox setting. Those who insist that pre-Christian art and culture are superior simply do not know the history of Christian art that well. They identify it with periods of decadence. The greatest works of architecture, music, painting, and literature in Western culture took form in the church. In architecture, we have the supreme example of the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. But we also have so many very old Romanesque and Gothic cathedrals, which are simply masterpieces of ingenuity in architecture. The finest bookmaking and calligraphy are those that come from the monasteries. And because we don't have so many of these anymore, and most people have not seen that many, we don't realize how beautiful books were. So that when printing was invented, the first attempt of the printers was to make a printed book look like an illuminated manuscript. Well, they abandoned this idea, but still, the early generations of books were really attempted to be made beautiful in their own way. The glorious many-voiced chant systems of the early medieval period gave birth to our music tradition. Painting and art in all its forms was handed down to us out of a uniquely Christian inspiration that we no longer understand or appreciate. We do not have a good idea of the inspiration that comes from personal sanctification. We don't know what it is. We don't know what sanctification is at all. But if we could see how it's described in the Orthodox tradition, we'd begin to understand that it's the very reason for our human existence. We forget, although there's hints of it everywhere, that fallen humanity, poor and broken as we know it and experience it, is not what humanity was meant to be. Now, there are great contemporary writers who demonstrate sanctification in a convincing manner, and they are quite inspiring. Two of them come to mind right away, and they're not as yet widely known in our culture. They are both saints in the contemporary world. One is Saint Sophrony of Essex, a unique writer unlike any other. He is probably best known for his life of Saint Silouan of Mount Athos, but his words are like fiery scrolls unrolling out of revelations in the interior life in God. I don't know how else to describe it. Very, very unusual and unique writing style. The other is a brilliant and talented ambassador from Serbia to America and England during World War I, and that is St. Nikolai Verimilovich. He was actually very well known in his day. He gave many public lectures in England and America. They were well attended. They were well publicized in the newspapers. People had never heard anybody speak like this person could speak. They'd never heard anything like it. And so he is often compared to the greatest orator of all time. Who is that? Well, it's not Cicero. It's not Seneca. It's one of the early church fathers that we don't know that much about in the West, St. John Chrysostom, called the Golden Tongue. When he would give his sermons, the cities would empty. Nobody would do anything except go to church and hear what he had to say. And his sermons were remembered and written down later by those who remembered them. So this is who St. Nikolai has been compared to. And there's others too, not so recent. Skilled writers of the lives of the saints and the life of sanctity. Master storytellers who describe the life of sanctification very specifically. Foremost among these is St. Dmitri of Rostov, who lived in the time of Peter the Great, and he's the author of the great collection of the lives of the saints. Now, it has all been translated into English. And he is a lively and engaging storyteller with deep spiritual perception and able to describe so that we can see and understand it how humanity can be made godlike. And I want to introduce these writers and say a little bit more about them. But before I get to them, I want to begin by talking about an American philosopher and seeker after truth in our own times, Father Seraphim Rose. Father Seraphim is very recent. He died in the early 80s. He was only 48 years old when he died, but his life had a huge impact. He's probably one of the most well-known advocates in our times for a return to the 2,000-year-old Eastern Orthodox tradition, and the popularity of his writings has increased since his death, not only in America, but also in Eastern Europe, especially in Orthodox countries that in recent times have become more secularized. For them, this American convert is a trusted guide to understanding what it is in their own culture that they're in danger of losing. Eugene Rose, later Father Seraphim Rose, grew up in California. He grew up Methodist, and in the 50s and the early 60s, he became a restless seeker after truth, like so many of my generation. He briefly became an atheist, looking for whatever was really true that he could find. And so for a while, he studied Chinese philosophy in San Francisco under Alan Watts. But he didn't have the best opinion of Alan Watts's moral character, which was that of the 60s bohemian circles. And Eugene Rose did not like that. He felt that it did not reflect Chinese philosophy in an authentic manner. And he was very serious about this. So he came under the guidance of another Chinese philosopher who's actually a native Chinese. But he became greatly influenced by the metaphysician Rene Guénon, who was a leading spokesman for what we call the perennialist school of philosophy. And this is mystical and metaphysical philosophy. Um, it's it's one of those that really insists that there is only one truth. There's one truth, and it's expressed perhaps differently in all ancient religions and philosophies, but it is a hidden truth and requires effort to find. And so this is esoteric philosophy, meaning hidden. And in his view, in the view of Rene Guénon, he believed that ancient man had a worldview that is foreign to the modern mentality. And he believed that we now have no respect or understanding of the sacred or of what mankind essentially is. He believed that the modern world is an aberration, cut off from truth and reality, and that the only way to find truth is to enter into an authentic ancient tradition and not try to alter it according to one's own understanding. So Eugene Rose found this philosophy more convincing than any other, and he began to look around for an ancient, authentic tradition. Where would you find such a thing in the modern world? Many of my generation went looking among Eastern philosophies, but he was surprised to encounter it in the Russian Orthodox exile community in San Francisco, a community of Russians who had fled from the communist persecutions. Well, what was so surprising about this? As it turns out, Rene Guénon also believed that Christianity had once been one of these authentic traditions, and especially he felt that the ritual beauty of the Catholic Church proved that it had once been an authentic spirituality, but that something had been lost in Catholic Christianity. And the Russian Orthodox agreed that something essential to the Christian understanding had been lost to the Western understanding. And what this was, then Eugene Rose encountered in the San Francisco bishop, who at that time was St. John of San Francisco. And this was a meek little man, kind of foolish in appearance, very humble, but somehow carried a tremendous spiritual presence. So this is St. John, the wonder worker of San Francisco. He's called the wonder worker because he performed many miracles. He healed many, many people of cancer, and is compared often to St. Nicholas, the wonder worker, who's also an amazing personality that we've caricatured into Santa Claus, but was actually a very great saint. St. John, the wonder worker of San Francisco, was like that. Even though he was very meek and very small and, as I said, kind of foolish looking. Well, the only thing for Eugene Rose to do at this point was to immerse himself completely in this tradition. And he did. And he learned Russian and Slavonic, and he eventually became a monk. And he founded a monastery in the Shasta Trinity Wilderness in Northern California. And this was a pretty primitive foundation because he wanted to return to the life of the ancients. He wanted to divorce himself from modern culture and modern conveniences and work and struggle and find out what this life actually was. And remarkably, he found it. And so Father Seraphim Rose is one of the first American converts to Eastern Orthodoxy. Another early convert is Father Lazarus Moore, who's also someone worth looking into. Well, Father Seraphim, with his deep perceptive intelligence, gained an acute understanding of the entire Western intellectual and cultural tradition from the time of the early church. And he was able to describe this and describe how Western culture departed from early Christianity little by little through the centuries, beginning really at the late medieval period. In the early medieval period, Western Christianity, Celtic Christianity, French Christianity in the early centuries was identical to the Orthodox way of life. But then it changed, and he was able to describe really acutely how these changes came about, beginning with medieval scholastic philosophy, where the mystical element was lost, and really it was the spiritual masters that were lost to the West. And then the Renaissance period, when people just, intellectual people began to turn away from Christianity back towards what was before Christianity, not understanding Orthodox tradition anymore. Through the Enlightenment period, where rationalism was primary and mysticism was considered superstition, and so on through history, that this progress led towards meaninglessness in our culture, through existentialism and finally nihilism as predominant philosophies of our time. Unfortunately, these writings have still not been published. I hope that they will be, but they have not been published yet. I was able to read them all in manuscript form many decades ago, and they had a huge influence on me. But another contemporary writer who's doing the same thing is Father John Strickland, who's writing also a series of historical books showing how Western culture and Western history and intellectual tradition has departed from the Orthodox tradition and from something that is essentially spiritual that has been lost. So when Father Seraphim Rose founded the St. Herman of Alaska Monastery, he also started the St. Herman of Alaska Press, and they began publishing widely. And they're the first English publishing house to do really quality Orthodox tradition. And I want to show one of the early books that they put out. And this book is unfortunately no longer in print. Hopefully it will be brought back into print later. This is The Life of the Fathers by St. Gregory of Tours, 6th century father, more well known probably for his History of the Franks, which is, by the way, an extremely entertaining read. It's not dry. In that book, St. Gregory was writing about people that he knew, things that he had witnessed, and he gives very, very lively descriptions of that time. The Life of the Fathers is his account of the saints of France who went off into the Jura Mountains, and these are the mountains that began to ascend up towards the Alps, looking for the desert monasticism that they knew existed in Egypt, desert monasticism that had been imported into the West through St. John Cassian, the Lorenz Fathers, and St. Martin of Tours, who St. Gregory of Tours was a great admirer of. Now, what's really important about this book? It's a landmark publication in English because it's really the first book that looks at what the early Christian worldview was. So, for example, what he's saying in this book is if you look at what most modern scholars will say about St. Gregory of Tours, Well, he was an interesting character. He was this quaint little man who spent his time taking care of and dusting off bottles of putrefying relics. And they just make him seem like somebody very, very foreign to human experience as we know it. But Father Seraphim Rose, having discovered the Orthodox tradition, says no. If you look at the writings of St. Gregory of Tours, if you're Orthodox, you recognize this world immediately. This is very familiar to you. You know exactly what St. Gregory of Tours is talking about and what he's doing, because this was the same thing that Father Seraphim Rose was trying to do. And the Life of the Fathers has an introduction that is really important. And that's why it's mainly for this introduction, but also for the Lives of the Fathers too. But for this introduction, that this book really needs to be brought back into print. Because what he does is he explains how Celtic Christianity is Orthodox Christianity. It's not something different, it's Byzantine. Um, so, for example, St. John Cassian, he talks a lot about him, went into the Egyptian desert. A generation after St. Anthony the Great, the founder of desert monasticism, had died. And at that time, his disciples were all over Egypt. And they were advanced spiritual fathers like St. Anthony had been. And so St. John Cassian went and sat at their feet and listened to what they had to say and wrote this all down in a book that's called the Dialogues, which are his memoirs of what these desert fathers had to say. And they give us the complete teaching of what monasticism is, what the real Christian life is looking for. And this is what was brought to the West. So St. John Cassian is important because of the dialogues that he wrote. They became very popular in Western monasteries. They were considered a guide. And they were a guide to St. Martin of Tours and the Lorenz fathers, who were off of the island of Lorenz in the south of Tours. And these early Gallic French fathers were basically living the same life as the life of St. Anthony of the Desert in the West. And St. Martin of Tours, his disciple was St. Ninian, who brought this way to Scotland. And St. Patrick went to Gaul for a while and studied under these fathers. So Celtic Christianity is a branch of this early Gallic monasticism that St. Gregory is describing. And it's a branch of Egyptian desert monasticism. So to understand what that is, this is something really important. It's something that we need to understand. And so I'm going to talk about it a little bit later on. One of the things that St. John, the wonder worker of San Francisco, Bishop St. John, noticed, he was in exile from Russia. He spent some time in France before coming to America. And he looked around and noticed that there were all of these saints in the early millennium of Christian history who were no longer recognized, much talked about. If they did, it was kind of fantastic legend that had no truth in reality. And he began to notice that it's pretty important for Western peoples to know who these early saints were and what they were like. So Father Seraphim took this to heart, and that's why he put together this book, The Life of the Fathers. This is about our own cultural tradition that we've lost. So it's a pretty important book, and I would like to see it brought back into print. One of the things that Father Seraphim makes clear is that there's principles in hagiography. Hagiography is the art of writing the life of a saint. And like iconography and musicology in the Orthodox tradition, there are certain rules to be followed. And within these rules, there's a great deal of creative leeway because people are involved. And so there's going to be creativity, of course, and individual style and all these things. But there's principles that have to be obeyed also. And one of these principles that's very important is that what you describe in the life of the saint, and it can be the most ordinary thing, or it can be some incredible miracle, or it can be something that he said, but it has to be the truth. It has to be real, something that actually happened, not a legend and not unverified. So the writer of a life of a saint has to do his homework and fact check. He has to make sure that these things that he records are coming from reliable witnesses and not just from rumor or hearsay. So that's very, very important. Um, and he writes this whole book in the lively style of all of the interesting articles of the Orthodox Word, which is the magazine that came from decades out of the St. Herman of Alaska Press. Um, and is still, very, very interesting articles, very illuminating. And as a matter of fact, the first copies of the Orthodox Word were printed in Northern California on a hand press with handset type because there was no electricity, there were no machines. This was the machine, was a hand-operated printing press. And so many of their early publications were done at just tremendous labor, and have really been important in building up a new culture of orthodoxy in America. All right, so we're talking about sanctification, what sanctification is. We're describing people who write about this from a point of view of experiencing sanctification themselves. And so let's say just a little bit about this. What is this spirituality of Orthodox sanctification? Well, it's a very positive view of the human potential because the whole human person can be healed and purified and then deeply illumined by God, by an active God, illumined in a literal manner. We are not speaking figuratively. The heart and soul are awakened as the mind is cleared of distraction, and through mystical union with God, the person is made godlike, made godlike. Miracle workers, people who can read other people's souls to help guide them. It's really something that you have to experience, but this is what we're talking about. So the life of sanctification is the point when Christ, the Son of God, God himself, became human for our sake, walked the earth, talked to us in our own language. It was not just to show off that he was God, but to help us, to make us like him. That's the point. Sanctification is the life that Christ wants to give us. Now, such a claim as attempting to become like God is obviously audacious, and it's something that we really shouldn't try to do on our own, but with help from God. But we're human, and if we try to make such an attempt like this, we're probably going to make some mistakes. And so being guided is very important. And it's easy to fall into delusion. We have to admit this. This is something that is just fraught with delusion. This is why Orthodox spirituality exists, to be guardrails, to be guides against destructive delusion, which is mostly fueled by pride, which is the one thing that Orthodox spirituality tries to free us from, is from pride, and to show what is humility, to provide a safe passage towards God. The only reason for the strict doctrinal purity of the faith is to guard this way towards mystical union with God and to make it possible. It's that important. So, to really describe what this is, I need to talk more about the writings of the Philokalia, which is a collection of spiritual writings, classical texts on spirituality. And this is something that we need to do and will do in future sessions. These are Ruminations from Among the Bards. I am Christopher Lewis, poet and author. I ask that you check out my books at Anaphora Press and on Amazon, and my writer's blog at Orthodox Illumination on WordPress. And I ask also, if you enjoy this talk and want to hear more, then please share this and subscribe to my channel. And don't forget to hit that like button.